Come on, let's get a coconut before we start. Can I get a coconut, please? Okay, now I'm ready. Let's go. Welcome back to the Lost and Found podcast, the space where we're figuring things out in real time together. I'm your host, Karin Vik, and come sit with me for a while. If you're a living, breathing, thinking human being, you've probably at some point in your life wondered, what is the point of life? What actually is the meaning? Why are we here? Maybe you've wondered that after a big heartbreak, or after graduation when you weren't sure what was next, or maybe just after lunch at your desk while you're working a job that you don't particularly enjoy. This question is really close to my heart, and I've actually arranged my life around the pursuit of that answer. And that's partly, I guess, why I'm here on this island in Sumatra, Indonesia, spending 2 months hitchhiking through the whole country, trying to meet new people, connect with a different culture, and find out what they think the answer is. I spent a lot of my travel time asking people from different backgrounds what they think is the meaning of life. And I guess I got a degree in philosophy and literature for the same reason. But the thing is, I'm not necessarily too fussed about getting the answer exactly right. I think we'll never really know if we got it absolutely right. And that's okay. That's just the nature of the question. And funnily enough, it's not really about the answer anyway. Not really. It's about the question. And it's about the process of trying to answer it for yourself. And that's what I love about philosophy. It deals with these big questions like, why are we here? How do we know things? What are emotions? And what does consciousness even mean? But it does not give us neat answers. It just gives you the tools to try and answer those questions for yourself. And of course, you get to study the history of how different philosophers have tried to answer the questions for themselves. And then when you see how different philosophers approach these answers, you can kind of pick and choose. You can say, that resonates with me, I'm going to take a little bit from that. Or what this philosopher says doesn't really make sense to me, so I'm going to ignore that. You can take what makes sense and leave behind what doesn't. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom, and it comes from the Greek philosophia. But the great thing is, it's not just reserved for academics. That's the best part. Every time someone asks, what should I do with my life? Or what makes something good? Or why am I here? Every time someone asks that, they are doing philosophy. You've done philosophy probably many times in your life without fully realizing it. But today, we're going to do philosophy intentionally. I promise it's going to be practical, and it's going to be understandable and also intellectually stimulating. And hopefully, after watching this episode on YouTube or listening to it wherever you do, on Spotify or whatever, after this, you will hopefully have a better idea of your own values and ideas about life. And when we have a clearer idea of what we value and about what we believe around meaning, then we can make more aligned decisions for our lives. And you can create a life that feels more authentic to you, a life that offers you more joy and satisfaction and energy. Do you see why this is important? Okay, firstly, before we go running through centuries of philosophy, we need to clarify something. When we ask, what is the meaning of life? What are we actually asking? Because sometimes we're asking about meaning, yes, but other times we're really asking about purpose. They're not always the same thing. Meaning is the big metaphysical question. It's those questions like, why does existence matter at all? Is there some cosmic reason? But purpose is smaller. That's more personal to you. That's a question like, what am I meant to do with my one particular life? Or how should I spend my Wednesday afternoon? Or who should I love? What should I build? You can believe life has no inherent meaning, but you can still wake up with a very strong sense of purpose in your everyday life. But you can also believe life has divine meaning, but still feel personally lost. So as we go through these different answers today, I want you to keep asking yourself, are they offering meaning or are they offering purpose? Or both? Because sometimes the dissatisfaction people feel isn't actually existential dread. It's just a mismatch between these two. It's not that you're actually spiraling about the void or questioning whether the universe has a grand narrative. It's just that your daily life doesn't align with what you believe life is for. You might believe life has deep spiritual meaning, but your work feels empty. Or you might believe life is about freedom, but you've built a routine that suffocates you, where there's no room for freedom at all. Or maybe you believe that the great meaning of life is love and connection, but you are actually prioritizing achievement and work. And then that friction comes in. That's when you start to feel a sense of restlessness, a sense that nothing really makes sense, and that's a crisis of alignment. Which means that you have an idea, consciously or unconsciously, about what life is about. But your actual choices, your habits, your career, your relationship, don't reflect it. And when meaning and purpose drift apart, that's when we start to feel like things just aren't aligning. You don't feel good. You feel disconnected from yourself. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about some theories about meaning and purpose so that you can try and answer this for yourself. I'm going to walk you through a lot of things that a lot of philosophers and schools of philosophy have said about the meaning of life. And I want you to then make an informed decision of how you'll piece your own answer together. Let's start with the most biologically unromantic answer possible. From an evolutionary standpoint, life doesn't need meaning. It just needs continuation. So according to evolutionary theory, which was most famously articulated by Charles Darwin, we are the result of millions of years of natural selection. Traits that help organisms survive and reproduce were passed on, while traits that didn't help us survive were let go or they disappeared. So in this theory, there isn't actually any divine blueprint. There's no grand narrative, no ultimate moral arc. There's just adaptation. And from this view, everything about us, our desires, our love, our fear of death, our competitiveness, even our capacity for cooperation, can be explained away in terms of survival advantage. So this theory would say that we fall in love because bonding increases reproductive success, or we fear social rejection because isolation once meant death. We experience pleasure because it reinforces behavior that keeps us alive. So in this framework, meaning isn't actually built into the universe. It's just a byproduct of brains that are complex enough to ask those kind of questions. You understand? And if you push this view to its logical conclusion, then it says life has no existential meaning. There is no cosmic reason why we are here, but organisms behave as if survival and reproduction are the goal, because those who didn't behave in that way didn't stick around long enough to pass on their genes. So in that sense, the purpose of life, according to evolutionary theory, if we can even use that word here, the purpose would then be continuation, survival, or reproduction. But okay, now the question becomes, is that actually enough for you? For some people it is. Because yes, biology can explain how we got to where we are. It can explain our instincts, our drives, our fears. But for me, and for many other people, it doesn't necessarily explain why it feels like something to be alive. It doesn't explain why beauty moves us, or why we create art that has no survival advantage, why someone would sacrifice their life for a stranger. Also, for people who don't want children, for example, clearly this answer would be unsatisfactory because the goal of their life is clearly not reproduction. Evolution in science and biology explains mechanism, yes, but it stays very silent on meaning. And for many people, that silence is unsatisfying. And then when biology feels too cold, philosophy tends to swing in the opposite direction. Because if survival isn't enough, maybe the point of life isn't continuation. Maybe it's just enjoyment. Okay, enter hedonism. So today, in our modern world, if you call someone a hedonist, they're probably someone who parties a lot, rarely works, chases excess, because in modern colloquial language, people like rock stars would be hedonists, right? Old people would often call young people hedonists in this derogatory way, implying that they have no moral backbone, basically. But that's not actually what the philosophy always was. Hedonism is an ancient philosophy. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece, around the 4th century BCE. And one of the earliest figures associated with it was Aristippus of Cyrene, who argued quite boldly, actually, that pleasure is the highest good. Immediate pleasure, even. So if something feels good and it doesn't harm you, why not pursue it? That was his philosophy. But the more refined and influential version of hedonism came from Epicurus, who lived from around 341 to 270 BCE. But Epicurus is often misunderstood. Like I said, when we hear the word hedonism today, we think party, excess culture, self-indulgence, this kind of chaotic pleasure-seeking thing, right? But Epicurus was surprisingly moderate. Yes, of course, he did believe that the goal of life is pleasure. But by pleasure, he meant something very specific: the absence of pain in the body and the absence of disturbance in the mind. And he called this state ataraxia, which means tranquility. And for Epicurus, the best life wasn't actually wild indulgence. It was just simple. The simple good life: good friends, good food, freedom from fear, and freedom from anxiety about death. He even argued that many of our desires are unnecessary and cause more suffering than joy, because we desire fame and wealth and power, but all these things just inflate the ego and disturb the mind. So real pleasure, in his view, came from learning which desires to let go of. And there's something kind of Buddhist about that, and appealing, to be honest, but I'll get to the Buddhist side of things later. What's appealing to me is how it aligns with how we are actually wired as humans. We move toward pleasure and we avoid pain. That's just biology. So why not elevate that into a philosophy? Why not say life is short, so maximize joy, minimize suffering, surround yourself with beauty and good people, right? But here's where it becomes interesting. So if pleasure is the highest good, what happens when pleasure isn't available? What happens, for example, during grief or loss or failure or illness? Does life then temporarily lose its meaning when it stops being pleasant? And even more subtly, is pleasure enough to satisfy our deeper longings? Because pleasure feels good, yes, but meaning feels significant. And those two are not always the same thing. You can be comfortable and still feel empty. You can be entertained and still feel lost. So yeah, hedonism gives us something really important. It reminds us that joy matters and that suffering should not be glorified. But it might not go far enough to explain why we are actually here on this earth. Let me give you a quick philosophical clarity point just for your own understanding. Hedonism answers the question, what should we value? It says, value pleasure. But it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why does existence exist at all? So it's more ethical than metaphysical. And because I know that not a lot of you studied philosophy, probably, I'm going to tell you what metaphysical means. Metaphysical simply means concerned with the nature of reality itself. So the big questions about existence, like why is there something rather than nothing? What is ultimately real? Does life have a deeper cosmic meaning, right? So those are the questions that we are concerned with when we are doing metaphysics. So metaphysical means meta, beyond the physical. Metaphysical questions are questions about things that go beyond the physical. Understand? I feel like I'm back in my third year of philosophy tutoring first years. I love that time so much. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Okay, anyway, let's get metaphysical. So if hedonism then answers the question of purpose, but not of meaning, then what does answer the question of meaning? The big question. Not what should we do and value while we are here, but the question of why are we even here in the first place? Enter religion. Because for most of human history, the answer to that question didn't come from biology or pleasure or philosophers. It came from God, right? So religion says life has meaning because it was given meaning. It says you are not an accident, you were created intentionally, you exist within a moral and cosmic order. And different traditions articulate it differently, but the core idea kind of stays similar. And that is that life has meaning because it originates from something greater than you. And that is powerful. because it removes the burden of inventing meaning from scratch. You don't have to construct meaning. You don't have to figure it out. You just inherit it. You read the story in the Bible or the Torah or whatever religious text you agree with or believe in. Okay, I kind of want to touch on the major religions and what they believe about meaning, but before I attempt that, I want to say something important. I am by no means a scholar of every major religion. Entire lifetimes and traditions are devoted to understanding these belief systems really faithfully and deeply. So what I'm about to do is definitely not a theological breakdown, and it's not exhaustive, and it's definitely not definitive. All I want to do is kind of gently zoom out and look at how different religious traditions have approached this question of what is the meaning of life, right? So we can understand the kinds of answers that each offers. And if you belong to one of these traditions and you feel that I've simplified it, that's probably because I have, and I'm really sorry. I'm not doing that out of disrespect, but only because the episode can only be that long. For many people across history, meaning is not something humans invent. It's something that is revealed. And in Christianity, life's meaning is rooted in relationship with God. So human beings are created intentionally in the image of God. And life is about loving God and loving others, and there's kind of an eternal horizon. This life is not the full story. You will live on after death, right? So meaning here is relational and eternal. And in Islam, life's meaning is found in submission to Allah. Not submission in a negative sense, but kind of in a sense of alignment with divine will. So life is a test, it's a trust, an opportunity to live righteously in accordance with revelation. So meaning here is obedience and devotion and moral accountability. In Judaism, meaning is deeply tied to covenant, which means a relationship between God and a people. So life is about ethical responsibility, community, law, remembrance, and kind of like participation in an ongoing sacred history. Meaning for them is communal and historical. In Hindu philosophy, meaning often revolves around dharma, T, or karma, which is action and consequence, and moksha, which is liberation from the cycle of rebirth. In this philosophy, life is part of a much larger cosmic cycle. Meaning here is alignment with cosmic order and eventual liberation. In Buddhism, the question shifts slightly. Rather than asking why we are here, it asks how we can be free from suffering. So the meaning of life becomes awakening, reaching nirvana, liberation from craving and illusion. Meaning here is transcendence of ego and suffering. And in a way, in Buddhism, they're really saying that the meaning of life is to let go of the search for meaning or the need to have meaning in the first place. But we'll get more to that later. Of course, each of these traditions contains enormous internal diversity, mystical branches, philosophical branches, cultural differences, all of things. But at a broad level, religion offers something that evolution and hedonism cannot, right? It offers a story in which your life is not accidental, a story in which suffering has context, in which morality is grounded, and that for many people is incredibly stabilizing. It makes them feel safe. But the problem here is that religion also requires faith. It asks you to trust in realities that cannot be empirically proven. And in a pluralistic world, so pluralistic means a world where many religions claim to be true, it can be difficult to know which story, if any story, is actually the ultimate one, the true one. And this is then where some thinkers began to ask, well, what if meaning isn't given to us from above at all? What if it isn't written into the universe? What if it's up to us to make meaning? Enter existentialism. Okay, I want to take you a bit back in time. Imagine this. Paris, the 1940s. The city is scarred by war. Europe has just witnessed 2 world wars within 1 generation. Millions of people are dead. Old structures like religion, tradition, the monarchy, they're all starting to crack under pressure. And people are now asking questions that they cannot ignore any longer. They're asking, if God truly exists, why did the Holocaust happen? If morality is fixed, if there are set things that are good and bad in the world and we're supposed to know them, why is there so much horror? And these are exactly the questions that were discussed in smoky cafes and Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where writers and philosophers were sitting around arguing for hours, chain smoking, thinking, trying to make sense of all of this. And out of that intellectual and emotional rubble, existentialism crystallizes. And at the center of it all is this man called Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Sartre famously said, existence precedes essence, which sounds really abstract, but it's actually very practical and radical. Because for most of history, people believed that essence came first, that humans were created with a fixed nature, so like a purpose built into them by God or by cosmic design. But Sartre flips that. He says, no. We exist first. We simply appear in the world. We start to exist. And only after that, through our own choices, do we define who we are. There is no predetermined script, no assigned role, no divine blueprint telling you what your life is for. You are just kind of thrown into existence, and then you must choose. You must create your own meaning. And that's terrifying, because it means you cannot blame fate or God or your nature. You must take accountability. Your life is yours. So not only are you free, but you are also responsible. Sartre even says we are condemned to be free. Condemned because we cannot escape choosing. Even if you refuse to make a choice, that's still a choice. Okay, that's a lot. In this whole situation, there's also another prominent figure called Albert Camus. Camus introduces this idea of the absurd. And the absurd is the tension between our desperate desire for meaning and the universe's absolute silence when it comes to this question. And he says that it's like we're shouting into the void, kind of searching for meaning, but the universe doesn't give us an answer. And in that silence lies the absurd. The absurd is the meaninglessness of life. But he says, don't despair, rebel. And when you rebel, don't do it with violence, but do it with defiance. You rebel by living fully, by loving, by creating, and continuing anyway, right? So even if life is meaningless, you rebel against that meaninglessness, against the absurd, by living in a way as if your life does have meaning, because you are actually the one giving it meaning. So then he starts to write about this myth of Sisyphus. And Sisyphus pushes a boulder up a hill continuously. And once he reaches the top, it rolls back down. And in this metaphor, in this myth, Camus sees life. So there's this meaningless struggle. I mean, there's not really any reason why we keep living, according to Camus, right? And so it's like we're pushing the boulder up the hill. But then Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. In other words, meaning is not found in the outcome. It's found in the act of choosing to live, in the act of choosing to keep pushing the boulder up the hill. Personally, I've always really been drawn to existentialism, not necessarily the absurd as far as Camus takes it, but I like the fact that existentialism doesn't hand you these prepackaged answers and comforts, but it kind of says that you are free. You are dangerously free, and every choice you make is meaning-giving. Your actions matter, and you are fully responsible for your own life. And this is not nihilistic. That's a really important point to make. Nihilism is the belief that life has no inherent meaning, no objective value, no truth, and therefore nothing matters. And if you take nihilism to its extreme, it can really lead to apathy, to this idea of why care, why build anything, why love, why try. If everything is ultimately meaningless, then all choices collapse into this kind of same weightlessness. One of the key figures often associated with nihilism is Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's a 19th century German philosopher. The interesting thing is that Nietzsche wasn't actually ever cheering nihilism on. He believed Western culture was heading towards nihilism. Remember, he's the one that famously said God is dead. But he didn't mean that literally, obviously. He also didn't say it in a way to challenge religion. He meant it as a kind of a warning. He meant that the traditional religious structures that once grounded meaning and morality were losing their authority. And his concern was, if we remove belief in God, if we remove objective moral structures from the world, what then replaces them? So he feared that society would then slide into nihilism, this belief that nothing has inherent meaning or value and everything will fall apart. But Nietzsche didn't want people to stay in that nihilism. He thought that nihilism was kind of a crisis or a transitional phase. And his solution was kind of radical. He said that we must create our own values, which sounds suspiciously close to existentialism, doesn't it? But existentialism goes further than nihilism. It doesn't stop there. Existentialism agrees with nihilism on one point. Both of them say that there is no pre-given cosmic meaning handed to you. But instead of saying, so nothing matters, existentialism says it's up to you. So it doesn't erase value, it just relocates it. Meaning is not discovered in the structure of the universe. It is created through commitment and your own actions. Nihilism says nothing has meaning. Existentialism says meaning isn't given, so give it. Through action, through choice, through taking responsibility for your own life. And in that sense, existentialism is kind of optimistic because it says you are free. You are deliciously, dangerously free. And that freedom is heavy because it means that your life is not predetermined, but it also means your life is open to reinvention and courage and becoming someone new. Existentialism doesn't collapse into nothingness. It's kind of like it stands at the end of nothingness and it says, choose to build anyway. So if there's no pre-written meaning, then every choice becomes creative. You are not discovering meaning, you are creating it, you are composing it as you go. Oh, do you understand why I love this philosophy so much? Okay, but another very important point I want to make here. When we talk about existentialism, we often center Jean-Paul Sartre. He became the face of the movement. He was this celebrity philosopher of post-war Paris, right? People loved him and hated him. But he wasn't alone. His partner, Simone de Beauvoir, was not just his girlfriend or partner, whatever. She was a philosopher in her own right. And in fact, many scholars argue that some of the most nuanced developments of existentialist ethics, especially around things like responsibility and freedom and how our choices affect other people, were actually most clearly articulated by de Beauvoir. So in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she takes Sartre's ideas of radical freedom, and then she asks a very crucial question. If we are free, what do we owe each other? Because existential freedom isn't lived in isolation. It's lived in a world with other people who are also free. De Beauvoir says something really important. She says your freedom is intertwined with the freedom of other people. And to deny someone else their freedom, like through injustice or oppressing them, like sexism or racism or whatever, if you're denying them their freedom, then you are inherently denying yourself your own freedom. Because we can only be free in a world where everyone is free. In her famous book, The Second Sex, she applies existentialism to gender, arguing that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. I'll never forget that quote, which is essentially existentialism applied to identity. So yes, existence precedes essence, but not just abstractly, socially too. Who you become is shaped by structures, by history and expectations. Existentialism at its best isn't just about individual freedom. It's about ethical responsibility within that freedom. But that raises an even harder question. What happens to meaning when freedom is stripped away? If existentialism tells us we are free and responsible for creating meaning, what happens in circumstances where choice is brutally limited? Think like big historical events like slavery and concentration camps and even the state of women's rights today in some Middle Eastern countries. In situations like that, can meaning survive that? That's a good question. And this is exactly where Viktor Frankl enters the conversation. Okay, so Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist. He was a contemporary of Freud, so he was a thinking man, a man with a career, a manuscript almost completed. He had this family, a whole life ahead of him. And then he was sent to Auschwitz, and his whole family died in the concentration camps. And he lost everything, his freedom, dignity, security, career, everything. And in that environment, where suffering was not abstract, but constant and brutal, he asked a question that feels almost impossible. If life has meaning, does it still have meaning here in the suffering? And it was out of that experience that he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He said, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Well, he believed that even when everything is taken away from you, you still retain the freedom to decide how you respond. So Frankl didn't argue that suffering is good. He didn't romanticize pain. But he believed that suffering can be really meaningful if we orientate ourselves towards it with purpose. And he argued that meaning can be found in 3 ways. Through work, so creating something that you care about. Through love, caring deeply for another person. And through the way we endure unavoidable suffering. And this is important because existentialism says there's no given meaning, right? But Frankl says, sure, but that doesn't mean there is no meaning available. Meaning is something we discover in the way we respond to life. That's what he says. Not just in freedom, not just in constraint or joy or tragedy, but in how we respond to everything. That's beautiful. So philosophically, what Frankl founded is called logotherapy, from the Greek logos, literally meaning meaning. So he believed our primary drives as humans is not pleasure, like Freud believed, or power, like Adler believed, but meaning. We can survive incredible hardship if we believe there is something or someone waiting for us at the other side. And that is powerful because it suggests that meaning is not fragile. It can survive even the worst conditions imaginable, the concentration camps, slavery, anything like that. So if I had to summarize Viktor Frankl in a few lines, it would be this. You cannot always choose your circumstances, but you can choose your response. And in that response, meaning is born. That's what he had to say. And this is why I think Frankl matters so much in this conversation, because existentialism can sometimes sound like privileged cafe philosophy, like something discussed over espresso in Paris by white people while the world burns. I get it. But Frankl wasn't in a cafe. He was in Auschwitz. And in that environment, certain answers would not have been psychologically survivable for him. So for some people, religion provides immense comfort in suffering. But for Frankl, asking where is God in all of this, or telling himself that there was some hidden divine plan behind the death of his family, that was just not an answer that would have sustained him. What sustained him in those circumstances was something completely different. And it was this idea that his life was not reducible to his suffering. That even if everything external was stripped away from him, he was still free to decide how he was going to react. And he was still free to decide who he would be in response to it. His identity was not the camp or the horror or the brutality. His suffering did not define his entire existence. His response to it did. And that shift is truly powerful because it means that existentialism is not just about self-expression or personal branding or choosing a career path. It's also about deeper things like dignity and reclaiming agency in the face of dehumanization. It's like saying you can take everything from me, but you cannot take my ability to choose my posture towards what is happening. That's not cafe philosophy. That is resilience. And this is exactly why philosophy matters for everyone in our everyday lives. Okay, now on the point of suffering, I cannot be talking to you about suffering without, of course, talking about Buddhism. And I know you might be thinking, didn't we already cover that? We already talked about religion. And yes, Buddhism is often grouped under the category of religion, but philosophically, it operates very differently from theistic traditions, like Islam or Christianity or Judaism. So theistic religions is religions that center around God. But Buddhism doesn't begin with a creator God. It doesn't anchor meaning in divine intention. And interestingly, it doesn't even start by asking the question, why are we here? It asks a completely different question. It asks, why do we suffer? And that shift means that it makes a huge philosophical pivot that's really interesting. So let's look at it. Now, we're no longer in post-war Paris. We're not in smoky cafes in Saint-Germain debating freedom over black coffee. No, now we're in northern India around the 5th century BCE. A prince has left his palace. He has seen sickness, old age, death. He has sat under a tree in meditation, determined not to rise until he understands the nature of suffering. And from that awakening comes a radically different starting point. Not the question of what is the meaning of life, but the question, why do we suffer? So the Buddha begins with what are called the Four Noble Truths. Firstly, life contains suffering. Second, suffering is caused by craving, so by attachment. And third, suffering can cease. Fourth, there is a path that leads to that cessation. This isn't about constructing meaning anymore. It's about seeing clearly. Okay, before we go any deeper, there are two big words used a lot in pop culture that are linked to Buddhism that I just want to touch on quickly. And that is detachment and nirvana. And I think both of them are really misunderstood. When people hear detachment, they often think of emotionless, coldness, not caring, withdrawing from life, withdrawing from love, becoming numb. But that's not what Buddhism means when it says detachment. Detachment in the Buddhist context doesn't mean not loving. It means not clinging, right? It doesn't mean not loving. It means not clinging. There's a big difference. You can love someone deeply and still understand that they are, and this relation is, impermanent. You do not own them. They are not yours to control. Attachment says, this must not change. But detachment says, I will love this fully, knowing that it will change. And when you make that shift, it reduces suffering. Because suffering often arises not from loss itself, but from this demand that loss should not have happened in the first place. Right? That's detachment. Okay, the second word, nirvana. Nirvana literally means to blow out, like to extinguish a flame. And again, people think this means disappearing or like some mystical floating off into the sky state. But philosophically, it just refers to this extinguishing of craving, the extinguishing of ego-driven desire, not the extinction of life, but the extinction of this constant grasping that keeps us restless. So nirvana is not apathy, it's freedom, freedom from needing reality to be different than it is. So to reach nirvana is to reach liberation from this cycle of craving and suffering, right? That's nirvana. Notice how different all of this is from everything we've talked about. Because existentialism says create meaning, and Frankl says find meaning in your response. But Buddhism says release the attachment that makes you demand meaning in the first place. Huge philosophical pivot, right? Because in Buddhism, the question now becomes, do we even need meaning, or do we need peace? Are we restless because life lacks purpose, or because we insist it must look a certain way? Wow, okay. But after all of that, we are still left with the question, what is the meaning of life? What matters? Okay, I want to quickly summarize. Evolution says survival, continuation, reproduction. Life doesn't need meaning, it needs persistence to keep on going, right? Hedonism says pleasure. Minimize suffering, seek tranquility. If we're here, we might as well enjoy it. Theistic religions say divine intention. You were created on purpose, your life is part of a larger story. Existentialism says there is no pre-written script. Meaning isn't discovered, it is created by you. Frankl says meaning is in how you respond to suffering. Buddhism says suffering arises from attachment, so release your grip. loosen the craving, find freedom in the letting go of the search for meaning in the first place. Lots of different points of view, right? And these are all very different ways of approaching the same question. And maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't choosing one and discarding the others. Maybe the answer is learning when each one is needed. I think there are seasons where you must create meaning, seasons where you must endure suffering with courage, and seasons where you must release. So maybe my answer to this question is that life is not static. So why would the answer be? I know it's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? Now you might be thinking, but Carmen, how do I then live tomorrow? What does this all actually mean? And this is where I want to share one more concept with you, the concept of Ikigai. And Ikigai does not necessarily answer metaphysical questions, but it does kind of give you a structure for your days, a structure for giving your everyday life depth and purpose. Ikigai is a Japanese term that roughly translates to reason for being. And you've probably seen the popular four-circle diagram somewhere online. If you haven't seen it before, it's usually drawn as 4 overlapping circles. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it on the screen now. One circle represents what you love. Another one represents what you're good at. Another one represents what the world needs. And then usually the 4th represents what you can be paid for. And where those circles overlap, in theory, is your Ikigai. It's your reason for being. This visual model was mostly popularized later, especially in the West. Traditionally, Ikigai can be much smaller and much quieter, like tending to your garden or caring for your grandchildren or maybe running a small shop or practicing a craft for decades. It doesn't have to be some kind of grand scheme or something that's entrepreneurial. At its core, Ikigai is about having something that makes you want to get out of bed in the morning and a reason to participate in life and society. It's not a cosmic explanation for existence, but it's more like a lived orientation. It's less concerned with the metaphysical question of why is there something rather than nothing, and more concerned with what gives my life rhythm, what feels aligned, where do my gifts meet the needs of the world in a way that sustains me. And in that sense, Ikigai can sort of feel like existentialism, but in a more grounded way. It says, yes, you must choose, but choose in a way that harmonizes love and competence and contribution and sustainability. And what I love about Ikigai is that it doesn't demand heroism. It doesn't say that you must now change the world. It simply asks you, what makes life, this particular life of yours, worth inhabiting? Cool. Maybe that's the most honest answer I can give you. After all the philosophers, after evolution and pleasure and God and freedom and suffering and detachment, all of these things, maybe the meaning of life isn't a single sentence. Maybe it's a practice. Maybe it's the ongoing act of aligning your days with what feels true to you. Because even if life has no grand cosmic explanation, we're still here. We still wake up, we still care and love. You still make plans for your future. You still feel disappointed when things go wrong and you feel grateful when they go right, which means whether you've articulated it or not, you already behave as if something matters. And that something is worth investigating. Maybe for you, meaning looks like building a family or creating art or serving God or alleviating suffering, working for the community, chasing freedom, exploring. Or maybe it's like living simply and peacefully. Or hitchhiking across Indonesia, asking strangers what they think life means. I mean, there's no one answer, but there is your answer. And the most dangerous thing isn't choosing the wrong philosophy, I think. The most dangerous thing is never examining the one you're already living by. Because if you don't consciously decide what you believe life is about, you'll inherit someone else's answer. Your parents, your cultures, industries, your algorithms, whatever. And that's where that misalignment really creeps in. When you start to live by someone else's philosophy, you start to make decisions based on what other people think we should value in our lives or what other people think are meaningful. And you don't know what you actually think is meaningful, what you value. So maybe the question isn't, what is the meaning of life? Maybe it is, what kind of life feels meaningful to me? And are my choices aligned with that? Because when meaning and purpose and action begin to align, even imperfectly, joy and energy follow. That's when you don't become as restless anymore. Friction eases. It feels like things flow to you more easily. Yes, you don't suddenly solve the universe, but you start inhabiting your own life more fully. And maybe that's enough. Maybe this is the whole point of this. I've asked so many people throughout my travels what they think the meaning of life is. I've asked cafe owners and hostel volunteers and other travelers, taxi drivers, fishermen, everyone, what they think is the meaning of life. And some people say happiness, some say family, some say faith. Some people laugh and say, well, I've never thought about this before. But every single person pauses. And maybe that pause, that moment of reflection, is the most philosophical act of all. Because it means we're not just drifting, we're asking. And maybe meaning isn't something we find once and for all. Maybe it's something we keep returning to. It's something that's almost lost and found, sometimes in transition. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this. You do not need a perfect answer. You just need an examined one, and then live it. I'm Carmen Vietz, and you just listened to Lost and Found. If this episode meant something to you, please share it. Maybe someone who's asking these same questions that you are asking. And like, subscribe, maybe leave a rating and a review if you're listening on a podcast platform. It really helps the show reach the people that need to hear it most. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you next week. And until then, don't forget to get a little bit lost. That's where the magic finds you.